Okay.
Fantasy sports went mainstream years ago, and it really started infiltrating my life around 2003. Now it's not just a hobby for me, it's a business. But how did it all get started? Larry Schechter, author of the book, The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. He joins me here today. Larry, welcome to the show, and thanks for the work that you did on this book. I think it's something that every fantasy player should understand.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So let's talk about the origins of this. When did this phenomenon get started?
Well, it depends if you include the precursors to modern fantasy. Basically the difference is, modern fantasy sports are based on events that haven't happened yet. So if you draft a fantasy football team, it's going to be statistics on the upcoming year that hasn't started yet. There were things that some people consider precursors. You can go back to the 1800s with the first tabletop game, where you would like slide a penny into like a spring activated bat. The bat would hit the penny and it would land in holes on your board for like a single or an out or whatever. So like that goes back to the 1800s. Then you had board games like Catico Ellis All Star Baseball. Then you got into things like Appa and Stratomatic, which were based on real major league players, but again based on the prior year statistics. So some people consider those precursors, but then actual, like modern fantasy football, fantasy baseball. Fantasy football was invented by a guy named Bill Winkenbach in 1963, and what's considered like fantasy baseball. Dan Okrent's the guy who is given credit for being the inventor of modern fantasy baseball, but actually there's a whole lot more to the story. There's a myth that he magically came up with the idea on a flight from Connecticut to Texas. That's not true. He didn't magically come up with the idea. There's a whole lot more to the story. It goes back, 20 years before that to his college days. And there are lots of people that were playing like primitive versions of fantasy football, fantasy baseball, before Okrent. And yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there are a number of people that have taken credit for that because we all follow stats and have been from the beginning of those being public knowledge to us. And I'm sure that you had some people that had no idea, of course, that it would turn into the industry that it's become, that were just counting stats. When I was growing up, I don't remember if I was ever told about fantasy and that is how this happened, or if it's just something that sports fans naturally gravitate towards. But when I was about 10 years old, my friends and I would get the newspaper, we would draft a team, baseball team, and then we would count the stats. And we had teams, we probably had like 4 or 5 players on it. It was very rudimentary. But that's the sort of thing. And keeping track of that on the newspaper, I mean, that's the way that people used to do this at a much more sophisticated level, of course.
Yeah, I've heard lots of stories like that. When I started researching the book, I mean, I spent 18 months as a full-time job researching the book. I had no idea what I was getting into. It was crazy. But I've heard lots of stories of people who were playing rudimentary games, like before Dan Okrent ever had his. And I've heard stories like what you said, and the thing is, what Okrent came up with was kind of like chess compared to everybody else's checkers. So and that's still, but his version of rotisserie baseball is still kind of like the same basic option format that people still play today for fantasy baseball.
Yeah, and that's crazy about it. Is I wish I could remember if somebody had told me about fantasy and it sounded interesting. So then that's why we started counting stats as friends, or if that's just something that you just sort of gravitate towards. How long did it take the fantasy world to become something that wasn't taboo? I'm sure that when it first started, especially for those that were putting stakes on the league, this wasn't something that was commonly talked about in circles. At what point do you think it became just okay before popularity? But it's somewhere between, I'm not talking about it with anybody but the people I play fantasy with, and what it is today.
Yeah, I mean, it started out where people didn't know what fantasy was, they hadn't heard of it, and everyone who would start to hear about it, a lot of people got this idea, which is something that you know geeks are playing this, and single men who live in their parents' basement are playing this, and over time, it became more widespread. Um, Another thing that was big is at the beginning, anybody who played in any league that had any kind of money involved, there was a question of whether or not it would be considered gambling. So some people tried to do it kind of, quietly because they didn't want the vice squad to show up.
Yeah.
And one thing about the book, I mean, I'll tell you, when I started this book, the idea was I want to write the history of fantasy sports because I saw that nobody has ever written a book like this. And it's like, how did this all happen? How did we go from ideas people had for games years ago to this mammoth industry we have now with, it's like a $25 billion industry. You got millions and millions of people playing all over the world, everything from fantasy football to fantasy wakeboarding, fantasy Iditarod. I mean, you got everything. So I thought, nobody's ever written a book like this. How did this all happen? I don't know. So I decided I'd write it. And what happened is very early on, I started to hear these amazing stories of what people had done. Like some of them are inspirational, some of them are just fascinating. There's a lot of humorous stories. And so I realized early on, I can write this book and just kind of like say what happened when, who did what, and I'll tell the story, but it's also going to come off as a very boring research paper. But when I started to hear these stories, I said, well, I'm going to tell the stories of the people. So it's going to tell all the information, but at the same time, it's going to be very interesting instead of boring. So that's where I got the subtitle of the book. The subtitle is "And the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen." And that's what's made the book really easy to read. People say it's fascinating. The reviews are just fantastic. Um, you got like, going back to what you were talking about, like some of these precursors. I mean, like you got a a kid who was 2 months shy of his 10th birthday. His parents lied to their local newspaper company told the newspaper company he was actually 10 years old. So he could start a paper route 2 months before his 10th birthday, so he could earn enough money to join his dad's football league. And then this kid who had just turned 10 plays in the fantasy football league with 23 adults, this 10-year-old and 23 adults, and he beats them all and wins their Super Bowl. And you got the first one of the first stat service. My book actually my book covers the origins that we just discussed, and then it gets into the first commercial fantasy games, the first publications, books, radio shows, TV, stat services, news services, legal issues, the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, injury experts, then through daily fantasy sports, worldwide expansion. I mean, I cover the whole thing. And I was just going to mention, like one of the first stat services was run by a married couple, Jim and Gloria Berger in Pennsylvania. And what you did back then is you'd have to get the stats. This is when computers, when computers started to be invented. That's when some people could start running stat services, because before then everybody had to do the stats by hand, which would take a league commissioner like 10 hours a week to do all the stats and get all the standings to everybody. So this couple, like, what they did then is you get the USA Today for baseball. Tuesday, USA Today would have the American League stats, and Wednesday they'd have the National League stats. So Gloria would read the stats out of the USA Today, and Jim would enter it in the computer, and then they get the reports out in the mail Wednesday night. So one Wednesday though, Gloria went into labor with her first child, but they didn't let a little thing like labor stop them from getting the stats out. So Gloria, she would read the stats, Jim would put them in the computer, and then she'd have a contraction coming on. She'd be like, wait, here comes one. Okay, it's over. And then she'd continue with the stats. So they did that like all afternoon, and they got it done, and their daughter was born, and they got the reports out in time. And 37 years later, today, the girl that was born that day plays in a fantasy football league with her dad, Jim.
That is fantastic. What an incredible story. What is CDM and how did their legal case reshape the fantasy world?
CDM was one of the first fairly big game operators that offered fantasy football, fantasy baseball, etc. And they actually teamed up with Sporting News, which helped them grow a lot, and later with USA Today. But what happened is I think it was off the top of my head, I think it was 2005. The Major League Baseball Players Association sold the rights to their fantasy game licensing to a company called Major League Baseball Advanced Media. And Major League Baseball Advanced Media decided they were going to severely limit the people that they granted licenses to. They just wanted like the big three, like CBS, Yahoo, ESPN, to have a license and pay them billions of dollars every year. And they were also going to offer their own fantasy games. So they told pretty much every other company, we're not going to renew your license. Now, not every company was licensed, but a lot of companies like CDM had a license. You're supposed to get a license from the players associations. So CDM had a license with MLBPA, with the NFL, et cetera. So anyway, so the Major League Baseball Advanced Media, so we're not going to renew your license, and basically they wanted to put them out of business. So we're not renewing your license, and you're going to have to stop doing this. And CDM, faced with the prospect of just going out of business, decided to sue them because the issue had never really been resolved whether or not companies like CDM need to pay the players associations to use the names and statistics. It's not like you got Derek Jeter doing a commercial saying, play CDM, it's wonderful. I mean, if you do that, obviously you got to pay Derek Jeter. But when you're using names and statistics, that was an open question. So CDM sued them. And it was kind of like a David versus Goliath situation because you had this company, CDM, that was not a huge company with their one attorney against Major League Baseball, against media, and Major League Baseball with their like 24 attorneys, in the fancy offices in Washington. So it's kind of like David and Goliath, but CDM actually won. And the court determined that they did not have to pay to use publicly available statistics from baseball games. And that decision kind of saved the industry. If they had lost, it would have severely damaged the whole industry. And of course, that ruling led to similar rulings for NFL statistics and hockey statistics and everything else.
You have been quite successful in the fantasy space. When did you know you were pretty darn good at this?
I don't remember exactly when that might have been, but I guess I started doing pretty well right from the beginning. And in 2002, I won this. Speaking of CDM, CDM happens to be the one where I won their big overall competition in 2002, and again 2005. Going back to the CDM case, I want again, I want to just let everybody know. I just kind of told the story of what happened with CDM. But then there's all this flavor again, the stories of the people, like all this flavor I got in the book. Like their CDM one attorney is named Rudy Telscher, and I interviewed dozens and dozens of people for this book. I also did massive amount of research, and I talked to Rudy at length. And Rudy told me a story about this. He told me several good stories that are in the book about this lawsuit. One of them was Rudy was based in St. Louis, where CDM is, and there was an arbitration or a mediation meeting with Major League Baseball where they were supposed to see if they could, maybe come up with a settlement. So the meeting was in St. Louis, and you got Rudy Telscher was there, and the four co-owners of CDM are there. Major League Baseball Players Association, Major League Baseball Advanced Media, they flew in like 24 lawyers for this meeting. So you got like 24 lawyers against one lawyer. And basically, Rudy's there to try to work something out. And the lead attorney for Major League Baseball stands up. He says, Rudy, we're here for just one reason. Either you start complying right now and shut down right now, or we're going to sue your company for everything they've got. And that was the end of the mediation. And Rudy said that, Major League Baseball, they flew 24 lawyers into St. Louis, put him up for a night at the Ritz-Carlton. Must have cost him like $25,000 or more. He said, that's got to be the biggest FU I've ever seen anybody.
Stories like this and more you can find. The book is titled The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. Larry Schechter is the author. Go find the book on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Thanks so much for the time and the info, Larry. Best of luck with the book.
Okay, thanks a lot.